One of the things you need, and it's very hard to get, sometimes it can take many years, you need a planning and zoning approval. You need to be able to get to the point in the development where you can get a building permit to build the project. Now, how do you do that? You need an architect, attorney, engineer, and you may need somebody to do a traffic study or a parking study if it's a big apartment project, environmental studies. Well, how do you find the right person? You go to a particular municipality. You go look at the projects that have been developed in that city over the last 10 years. You look at how long each one took from the initial application to its final approval and whatnot were that got that a project approved quickly, and who the specific engineers, attorneys, and architects were, and you go talk to them and you see if you can hire them. Because if they've gotten 4 or 5 projects through very quickly in the last 7 or 8 years, they're the ones who are going to perform the best for you.
And that's a great way of creatively just putting together your team, because I think your team is probably the most important part to getting a deal done, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
you want somebody who knows the game in that community, and you need to take their advice. Do you want all market rate? Do you want some affordable? They need to tell you what you can and can't do in that community.
Let's go through maybe just a couple examples of where you had to be creative to put a deal together.
I went to this one community and dealt with 5 properties, all of which had negative cash flow. 3 of them had tax credits. I went to the banks that owned the tax credits because that counts against their CRE requirement. I said, look, this bank has the mortgage on this property. They're going to foreclose. They're going to wipe you out. You'll lose your tax credit investment. Why don't you buy the mortgage, keep it in place at the full amount, postpone the payments, and when the tax credits are over, you're going to end up owning the property. The market will have changed. The rate will have gone up. The rents will have gone up, and you'll own the property and you won't lose any money. And I said, oh, that's a great idea. And so we were able to do that, and that's something I've repeated in a number of places. One of the things that people don't look at when you subdivide 50 acres of land into a single-family residential subdivision, each municipality has their own road specifications. Do they require asphalt curbs or concrete curbs? And whether it's a single-family subdivision or an apartment project, you have to option the land. You have to do market studies to determine whether you want to build efficiencies, 1s, 2s, 3s, 4 or 5 bedroom apartments. And you have to do that market study, and you may learn, oh, this market will accept 300 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms a year. But then what you have to be careful about is that there are not 2 other developers also planning to meet that same requirement. So there's going to be an oversupply in that community. So the puzzle gets bigger and bigger and more complex. And then every community has different fees. And you also need to be really careful about looking to see where's the water line, where are the gas lines. Because if you are a mile away from the gas line and you want gas on your property, you have to pay the gas company the money to put the line in. Where's the sewer line? Sewer only flows downhill. Well, if you're building at the bottom of the hill and you've got to get over the hill to the sewage plant, you have to build a sewer pumping station, which is very difficult, expensive, and because it's got to run 24/7, even if the power goes out, it's got to have generating capacity. There are all of these pieces to the puzzle that come together, and I've just touched on the very tip of the iceberg.
Welcome to another episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Today, guys, I have Mr. George Gager on the podcast today, and I first found George on LinkedIn, believe it or not, and I'm so grateful he responded to my message because if you don't know, about 80-90% of the people in the world ignore my messages, but I'm out there, I'm on a journey, and I'm trying to get the best people to talk about affordable housing, because if we can just get more people with the right energy and willingness to spend the time to contribute a little bit to the solution of the affordable housing problem, I believe that's how we solve the problem. And George has been part of over 20,000 units. So he brings a wealth of experience to the podcast today. So George, how are you doing today, man? I'm so excited for this podcast.
I'm great. I'm here in the San Francisco Bay Area. It is a beautiful sunny day. The weather's always good. It rarely rains. And as I told you the other day, if I get on a ladder and stand on the roof, I can see San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, Marin County, everything. And Golden Gate Bridge. And if I don't want to stand on the roof, I can just walk a couple hundred yards down the road and I got the same view. But
Man, George, I envy your view, that's for sure. And man, you have just been part of so many development projects in the past. I mean, let's just start from the beginning a little bit. How did you even get into real estate development in the first place, George?
Well, it's genetic in my family. My father's family, my mother's family. It goes back many, many generations. As I told you, my grandfather built the first multi-story parking garage in Connecticut, in New London, Connecticut, in 1914, when there were only about 500,000 cars in the whole country. But there was this big train station, and everybody was getting dropped off by horse and buggy, but they wanted to park a car. And he took this old manufacturing plant and turned it into a parking garage because there was no place to, if you were going to park your car, you had to park it and walk 3/4 of a mile to get to the train station.
Oh,
So this was a block from the train station. And that was built, completed, and opened in 1915. And my father owned it eventually. And that's what he sold it. And that's what put me through college. But my grandfather was in the epidemic in 1918 and died when my father was 4 years old. And he was determined to become a doctor. But he managed real estate. He managed all his father's real estate. And that's how I learned, because on our weekends, we were always going to visit these retail stores and parking garage and making sure everything was working fine.
wow. What a story.
So we never gave up on it. And what I did, I was going to be an architect. And while I was in college, and I was taught all the building trades, the family made sure I learned all the building trades. I went to a local builder to see if I could get a summer job in college working as a carpenter. And I'm being interviewed. And as the interviewer asks me what I want to do, I said, well, ultimately, I want to become an architect. And as I said that, the head of operations walked by the door. He stuck his head in and he says, can you draw a set of working drawings for a single family house? And I said, of course. He said, can you start tomorrow? I said, sure. So I started, and I was doing designs for subdivisions of 50 and 60 houses where there'd be 10 or 12 standard houses, and they would get repeated throughout the subdivision. That's fairly standard. And then I started doing apartment buildings, and they were very unusual. Most developers either build market rate or affordable housing today. They specialize. This company did both. And it was, in those days, it was FHA 235 housing, Section 8. So I did both market rate and affordable housing all through college. Went on to grad school, University of Oregon Graduate School of Architecture. And the developer called me and said, look, I need you. Can you stop going to school and come to work for me? And he made me an offer that I couldn't refuse. And I said, well, what are we going to design? He said, you're not. You're in charge of land acquisition. And here I am identifying, overseeing the design, and obtaining the entitlements for what would become the 7th largest apartment builder in the United States. And in final 4 years working for this company, I sites and obtained entitlements for 3,500 units when I was just 1 year out of graduate school.
Wow, George, what a
that was
story.
Well, I was working 14 hours a day, and I was driving about 45,000 miles a year in Connecticut.
Oh, wow.
Which is the size of the Bay Area, right? I mean, it's tiny, and computers weren't big at that time. So we had this big warehouse with file cabinets. Connecticut has 169 municipalities. I had the planning and zoning regs and maps for every one of those communities. And so it was a nightmare. But we were buying old tobacco farms, old factories. We were converting things to apartment buildings. And we had one project. He had secured the land before I'd started working for him. One project in Middletown, Connecticut, which was about 2,660 units, a mix of single family and multifamily units, many of which I 3 of the subsections while I was in college. A place called Trolley Crossing was one of them. And it's still there today. You can look it up on Google Maps. It's Westlake Village in Middletown, Connecticut. It's a great property. His name was George Achenbach, and he got rid of the company and moved to La Jolla, California, where he started Allied Schools, which trains brokers online to take the exam. You do the education. In his late 90s, I think. He retired a few years back and sold the company, but his wife still works there, or she did the last time I looked. I think she's like the CFO or something, and the family worked there, and it was great. He hired me because my name was George. If you applied for a job and your name was George, there were half a dozen Georges in the company, and it was crazy. But that's how I got started. Then I went on to a big builder developer and became CFO, the chief operating officer of the E&F development, which was affiliated with the E&F construction company, which built the Xerox World headquarters in Connecticut. We built jet engine facilities for Pratt and Whitney, helicopter plants for Sikorsky. We did regional offices, the Hartford Insurance Company, Mass Mutual, because there were a lot of insurance companies in the Connecticut, New York area. We did a lot of specialty work for them. We did the Exxon Chemical headquarters. And then we did public housing. We built public housing. We built affordable housing. We built exotic waterfront mansions on Long Island Sound. And again, working 12 to 14 hours a day, 5 or 6 days a week, going to planning and zoning meetings, One of the things I say is that the real estate development business is like one of those 1,000-piece puzzles that you work on Sunday afternoon, and you've got to learn how to put all the pieces together. And you don't do that working a 40-hour week. You have to love it. You have to be passionate about it. And it's just the way it is.
And George, I completely relate to your puzzle analogy. I tell people all the time when they say, hey, affordable housing, you can't solve it. And I disagree. I was like it's just eventually.
If you learn how to put the pieces together.
That's right. And every guest that comes onto this podcast is a piece to that puzzle. And George, for people that are learning
I hire those. I bring them together. I've done but one person can't do the entire project themselves.
Correct.
The key is identifying the best professionals. And I've got a couple of little secrets for how to do that.
Okay, so let's go through that. Maybe just a couple examples of where you had to be creative to put a deal together. You have any stories you can share with us?
I can share some general information. One of the things you need, and it's very hard to get, sometimes it can take many years, you need a planning and zoning approval. You need to be able to get to the point in the development where you can get a building permit to build the project. Now, how do you do that? You need an architect, you need an attorney, you'll need an engineer, and you may need somebody to do a traffic study or a parking study if it's a big apartment project, environmental studies. Well, you go to a particular municipality, let's just say San Francisco. Well, how do you find the right person? You go look at the projects that have been developed in that city over the last 10 years. You look at how long each one took from the initial application to its final approval. You look and see who the architect, the attorney, the engineers, and whatnot were that got that project approved quickly. You identify the top two and who the specific attorneys and architects were, and you go talk to them and you see if you can hire them. Because if they've gotten 4 or 5 projects through very quickly in the last 7 or 8 years, they're the ones who are going to perform the best for you.
And that's a great way of creatively just putting together your team, because I think your team is probably the most important part to getting a deal done, right?
Yeah. Oh, you want somebody who knows the game in that community, somebody who is respected and trusted, and you need to take their advice. They need to tell you what you can and can't do in that community. Do you want to build 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom apartments, or do you want 3 and 4-bedroom apartments? Do you want all market rate? Do you want some affordable? And we were building houses that were very affordable. When I was in college, we were doing homes that were selling for $28,000. That was a long time ago. But
right. Unheard of now.
Today, those houses that same house is $250,000. And you also need to be really careful about looking to see where's the water line, where's the sewer line, where are the gas lines? Because if you are a mile away from the gas line and you want gas on your property, you have to pay the gas company the money to put the line in. One of the things that people don't look at when you subdivide 50 acres of land into a single-family residential subdivision, each municipality has their own road specifications. Do they require asphalt curbs or concrete curbs? It makes a big difference in the cost of the road if you have to put in concrete curbing. How thick does the asphalt have to be? And all of these issues And then every community has different fees. They have different fees for hooking up your water line, your sewer line. The power company has different fees for your electric line. Sewer only flows downhill. Well, if you're building at the bottom of the hill and you've got to get over the hill to the sewage plant, you have to build a sewer pumping station, which is very difficult, expensive. And because it's got to run 24/7, even if the power goes out, it's got to have generating capacity. There are all of these pieces to the puzzle that come together. And I've just touched on the very tip of the iceberg. And if you don't have sewer lines, if you have to build a septic system, you have to do soil tests to find out the rate at which the soil will absorb the water out of the septic tank in the sewage field. And if you have to drill a well, you go better before you close on the property, you better drill a test well to see how deep you have to go. Because I've drilled wells that are 60 or 80 feet and don't cost anything. I've drilled wells that are 400 and 500 feet and cost a fortune. And what's the capacity? You have to test the water. There are all of these pieces. And how do you start out? Whether it's a single family subdivision or an apartment project, you have to option the land. Now, let's say the seller wants $8 million for his parcel. You're going to build a lot of apartments, but you've got to get the planning and zoning approval. You got to do design, get the planning and zoning approval. You have to get the financing lined up. You have to do market studies. Now I'm adding to the puzzle. Market studies to determine whether you want to build efficiencies, 1s, 2s, 3s, 4, or 5-bedroom apartments. And you have to do that market study, and you may learn, this market will accept 300 2-bedrooms and 3-bedrooms a year. But then what you have to be careful about is that there are not 2 other developers also planning to meet that same requirement. So there's going to be an oversupply in that community. So again, the puzzle gets bigger and bigger and more complex.
Well, I want to emphasize, like, George, the way you're describing it, it's so much of it is risk management, right? You just talked about, hey, the market study says this market needs 200 2-bedrooms and 200 3-bedrooms, but you have other permits that are already in position or in the pipeline to build those units. You might be oversupplying, and that's a tremendous amount of risk for whatever your underwriting is, right? That's why I think it's so important for understanding all these factors, because like you said, the deeper you got to drill for the well, that increases your capital cost, increases your capital stack. And now you got to figure out from your underwriting perspective, how does that affect your ability to service the debt? Because now you got to borrow more money. And I always harp on the fact that people just think about Excel files and they're like, put it in a model. But you got to understand why you're putting that number into that model, and it better support all the pieces of information that you have gathered to date, and also account for things that you might not have expected.
And I can tell one exotic story I told you the other day.
Please.
I worked for this company. They had a subdivision that was extremely attractive on the water, on the shoreline of Connecticut, where houses cost a fortune. And when you have a view of the water, maybe your subdivision has a dock where you can put your boat. It's really wonderful. So while they were framing the house, they had a lot of leftover plywood and wood scraps. And the project manager said, look, down in the marsh there next to the water, why don't you dig a hole and just bury all that stuff? It'll rot away in a few years. So the backhoe went and started digging a hole. And the arm with a bucket on it reached down, came up, and there was this big black cable. I said, what's that? There's no easement on the survey? What is this? It's a wire. And they were trying to decide, and the project manager said, let's just stop. And then about 15 minutes later, 2 Jeeps with Marines in full body armor with automatic weapons showed up. We had dug up the ARPANET, the precursor to the internet that carried Defense Department signals to the U.S. submarine base 6 or 8 miles away in Groton, Connecticut.
Oh, wow.
Now, all we did is lift the cable out of the mud. It was 5 or 6 feet down in the mud along the shoreline in an area where no one could ever build anything. And the bill for repair, and we didn't damage the cable, but we had to bury it under supervision of the government. And this was a long time ago. I was not present. I was in the headquarters working, $18,000 just to rebury the cable.
Wow.
And that was a big piece of the cost of the house. So anything can happen. And many, many years later, when I was working in Detroit on a City of Detroit property that belonged to the City of Detroit, and the City of Detroit owned the water company. It was a division of the city. They had a giant water main that wasn't on any of the maps, an 18-inch water main tied to 2 water towers, and we dug it up. Unfortunately, we broke the pipe, but fortunately, we were working for an agency of the City of Detroit, so it didn't cost us anything. But it tells you the lesson, or teaches you the lesson, that you've got to be careful when you're digging underground. You don't know what you might hit. And that's one of the reasons you need to do, when you're looking at a property, you need to know how far down the bedrock is and what wires are there, what plumbing is there. Are there water mains, sewer mains, gas mains? And a lot of our older cities don't have very good records. The city of San Francisco is still using some of its original water mains. In some of the northeastern areas in Connecticut and Massachusetts, near Boston and Hartford and whatnot, and White Plains, New York, a lot of those cities are still using some of the original water mains. And you never know how complete the records are.
Wow. I mean, just talk about making sure you set aside contingencies. Yeah. I mean, this is contingencies on top of contingencies, because even when you do the right due diligence, but because of bad records, I mean, you just never know what you're digging up. So, right. George, I really love those examples that you just brought up. And we talked a little bit about entitlements. And what I've noticed from how you talked about is because your experience is so diverse, from subdivisions to apartments to industrial complexes. I mean,
right. Hospitals. I've done a lot of hospitals.
Like that. It's the breadth of projects you've done is amazing. And if you had to go back to like, what are some of the biggest problems that people might run across? What would you suggest that they really look out for when they're entering into the world of development?
When you look at a piece of property, first you look at the market. What is the market? You have to analyze the market. Is there a special type of building, the design that you can build? You have to look at all the utilities, and you have to look at the future of the community. Are all the farmers selling off their land? Where are the nearest highways? Are there going to be expansions? Even back in the day, it used to take 4 or 5 years to design and obtain approvals, do the land acquisition for a new turnpike, an interstate highway. You want to learn, are there any planned? And what's the traffic going to be like? One of the things that a lot of developers don't look at is, where's the water? Stop and think about Connecticut. One side of Connecticut is all water. The biggest cities, a lot of the biggest cities in Connecticut are along the water. New London, New Haven, Bridgeport, Greenwich, one of the richest communities in the country, Stamford. Look at Long Island. The water's on both sides. That means that when you're commuting into New York City from Long Island, there's a lot of traffic. That's why there's so many highways in Long Island. If you look at Bridgeport, Connecticut, if there's a corporation or a company or a bank or a manufacturing facility in Bridgeport, one side is water. So instead of accessing the city from both sides, you only got one side. Look at San Francisco. Huge problem. They've got that peninsula with the city of San Francisco on it. And yes, they've got bridges going over there. But all the cars to get to work, you have to have bridges. So they built BART. In the 1972 and 3, they started building BART. The problem is now nobody uses BART. The parking lots are empty because of COVID. People are driving to work or working from home. I had an office in San Francisco that was 12 and a half miles from my home. Some days it took me 2 hours to get home.
Wow.
Because the traffic was so heavy on the bridges. Yeah, there are bridges across the bay, but the traffic can be amazing. A single accident can shut down the highway for a couple hours because the tow trucks and the ambulances can't get there. You just don't know. So I would go into the office at 6 in the morning and sometimes come home at 8 at night when the traffic wasn't a problem. And then it was less than half an hour to commute, 22 minutes or something like that, because I'm a mile from an interchange and my office was a couple hundred yards from an interchange in San Francisco.
Wow. I mean, it just goes to show you how deep you have to look at the quality of life for wherever you're building. Because,
Right.
I mean, if you're
And if,
sticking someone with 2 hours traffic, they don't want to live there anymore. It's just
well,
common sense.
if you're a developer, you have to look at where people are working and look at where you're building. Now, I think years ago, we built the headquarters for the General Reinsurance Company. Now they've moved back to New York, but we built their headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut. Now, we took a map, and this was in the days of push pins, not Google Maps. And all the senior executives, we put red push pins on their house where they lived. And then we had pink push pins for all, staff, and green and yellow and blue, and depending on what their position was. Then we looked at where is the best place to put their corporate headquarters. So the key employees, the senior executives, we made a judgment about where to locate the headquarters. And that's how we picked the property. So you have to be clever. You have to think about this. And it's not magic, it's science. Today you can use Google Maps. Google Maps uses electronic push pins, strangely enough. I don't know if you know that, if you've ever done that. And there's some software called Google Earth, which has more detail. I use that mostly because it has the elevations and whatnot. And I've worked in 41 states in the last 25 years. And you have to look at not only the transportation issues, you have to look at the future, the politics. Also, while the low-income housing tax credits are federally provided, the allocation per state is made by the IRS, and you can't negotiate with them. But every state has its own set of regulations for administering the low-income housing tax credits. Like San Francisco like California has a very clever program. And some other states have less creative programs. And low-income housing in many states is owned by tax-exempt entities, and therefore it doesn't have to pay property taxes. But there is one state that I won't name that does not allow affordable housing to be property tax exempt. They charge property taxes. And the factors that we've talked about are what determine where industrial development happens. That's the first step. Then the people follow. Let me ask you a question. Imagine that there's a border, a red line on the coastal areas of the United States that is 50 miles wide. So there's the red area along our coastal areas for 50 miles inland is painted red. What percentage of our population lives within that red area?
Oh, wow. I'm going to say 50% plus. What do you think?
Exactly.
Wow.
Just over 50% of the population of this country lives within 50 miles of the coast. Why? Because all our business in the early days was shipping. It was all
that
shipped.
Makes a ton of sense.
Before trains, it was shipped.
Wow. That makes a ton of sense. And sometimes you just forget about some things that seem so common sense and logical, but there's data and logic behind that. And that makes complete sense.
And we were a farming country early on. How do you move the food? Up and down the rivers with ships. That's the only way you can get rid of it.
That's right.
You couldn't have horse-drawn wagons. You didn't have trains. Then we had trains. The tracks follow the rivers because that's a low, stable ground that goes through the communities that had been built. Along the coast from Maine or Boston, from Boston to Washington, D.C., are some of our heaviest areas with train tracks. Around Chicago, along the West Coast. And now they go through subdivisions with multi-million-dollar houses because they're pretty close to the water.
Well, George, we talked a lot about what it takes to get a project approved, what it takes to look at a project, see if it's even feasible or not. But when it comes to financing, George, what have you seen in terms of ways that people can get development projects financed? I know you mentioned LIHTC earlier, but let's just talk about how you have been able to get the right financing in place to build all this housing.
There's two ways, or there's two types of housing you have to talk about. You have to talk about affordable housing, and then you have to talk about market rate housing. Now, market rate housing, local banks. And if you're talking about market rate apartments, It's really pension funds. The people who are willing to finance market rate housing, they want a low risk loan because they're handling people's pension funds and savings deposits. They have to be liquid assets. There's no federal loan guarantees for those. There might be if you're a veteran. So that's where you're going to get your interesting deals. But if you're looking at affordable housing, there's more risk involved. Rents have gone up astronomically in the San Francisco area, the New York area, some of our bigger cities in LA. And so what happens is those market rents could drop because it's calculated as a percentage of your rent. The part you pay is in public housing is determined by your income. Section 8, it's determined by your income. But the cap rent is determined by the larger marketplace, essentially the middle range of the rent. So let's say that the market rents in the 50th percentile, I'm going to just use a round number, not an accurate number. Let's say I can give you the San Francisco area. Market rents for a 3-bedroom house or apartment in Section 8, about $3,500, between $3,200 and $3,500, depending on the community. Now, the tenant is only going to pay essentially 30% of their income for that voucher, but the landlord's going to get that full amount of money. Now, if Prop 33 in California were to pass, or if something were to happen, let's say something in the marketplace. Now, we have a lot of vacant homes in San Francisco that are owned by investors. Market rate homes, they're owned by investors. They're vacant, but it's like putting money in the bank. The value of the unit goes up so fast. So there are over 50,000, and I'm being conservative, over 50,000 vacant units in San Francisco right now. Across the street from my home, there are 2 houses that are owned by foreign investors. They have a caretaker living there, doesn't pay any rent, or his job is to make sure the house is cared for, nobody breaks into it, nobody steals the copper pipe or whatever. They're a caretaker. And those homes are worth over $2 million each. The house down the street from them or across the street from them might be $1 million or less. But they're very elaborate homes with great views and whatnot. But if the value of that home goes down for whatever reason, the state passes some regulation on rental increases. California, your rents cannot increase now. There's currently a law, 10% a year is the maximum increase you can experience. Some communities have much lower, 2, 3, 4, 5%. So there's all of this that could happen with affordable housing. Now, who invests money in mortgages in affordable housing? We have the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, which is a requirement of local banks to invest a certain percentage of their assets in affordable housing. We have VA loans for the veterans. We have FHA loans where there's a government guarantee on 80% of the payback of the loan. So the bank has a smaller risk. They can't lose all their money. There are all of these programs, but who wants to invest their capital in that? A few pension companies do. Some of the big insurance companies will. But local banks, Wells Fargo's invested a small fortune in affordable housing in the Bay Area. So have a couple of other national banks. Silicon Valley Bank, which had its own set of problems, had a lot of money invested in affordable housing. They get now a smart bank will not only invest the money, they'll grab the tax credits too. I've run into, HUD has sent me to communities where there's a troubled affordable housing project. Now, I went to this one community and dealt with 5 properties, all of which had negative cash flow. 3 of them had tax credits. I went to the banks that owned the tax credits because that counts against their CRE requirement. I said, look, this bank has the mortgage on this property. They're going to foreclose. They're going to wipe you out. You'll lose your tax credit investment. Why don't you buy the mortgage, keep it in place at the full amount, postpone the payments, and when the tax credits are over, you're going to end up owning the property. The market will have changed. The rate will have gone up. The rents will have gone up, and you'll own the property and you won't lose any money. And I said, oh, that's a great idea. And so we were able to do that there. And that's something I've repeated in a number of places.
But I love your pitch there, George, because you're looking out for the tax credit investors' best interests. Because the last thing you would want them to do is lose their investment in its entirety. But if they're already a bank and they can buy the loan, then theoretically they own the property on paper because they own the debt on it.
Yeah.
So that makes a ton of sense for how you can save or turn around a project. And maybe, George, let's dive into for 5 minutes. Like, why do these properties become or get into a negative cash flow situation? Like, for affordable housing investors listening to this podcast right now, what can they do to prevent themselves from ever entering into that situation in the first place? What kind of mistakes have you seen people make?
Well, this is part politics and it's somewhat social, but you have to look. I'm assuming you've put together a few pro formas in your life, financial pro formas. I've done hundreds and hundreds. The first ones I did, when I put them in the computers, the Excel spreadsheets now recalculate in a few seconds. It used to take 8 or 10 minutes to recalculate the spreadsheets in the early years. And we were paying $25,000 to $30,000 for the desktop computers. I'm talking about in the late 70s.
Wow.
When I first started doing this. And we didn't have the fancy booklets and the projectors. We would tape the 50 sheets of the pro forma for the next 30 years to the conference room wall, and all the executives would walk around and look at it with magnifying glasses. That's how it started. Okay?
Wow, thank you for that story. That's insane. That's we take for granted right now.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, people do. You can put together a pro forma for a 400 unit tax credit project in a couple hours. You know, it's pretty simple. But here's what you have to stop back and look at. When you have an affordable housing project, all of those projects are to some extent sponsored by the federal or state government because you have low-income housing tax credits, tax-exempt bond financing, investor requirements like the CRE. There are all of these reasons that the government supervises this. And they're afraid of the developers because how do you know when a developer is lying to you? Because once he starts moving his lips, you know he's lying. That's the word out there in the banking industry. A banker shared that with me. So when they establish what the rent for a community, what you can charge, it's about historically it was the average for a large area. Like in all of San Francisco, now San Francisco is a city and a county, the limits are the same. The Section 8 rent was uniform throughout the city. Now, HUD and the federal government and the IRS, everybody, those rents are now being created by zip codes. Great deal more flexibility because a city like San Francisco has many zip codes and the rents are different in a market. But let's just say that the market rent for, let's use an easy number, for a 3-bedroom apartment, and this is high, is $3,000. For a 1-bedroom, it's $1,000. For a 2-bedroom, it's $2,000. Now, if the Section 8 voucher is at the 50th percentile, it's not going to be half. It's not going to be $1,500, but it might be $2,400 or somewhat less. Well, that's all the landlord is going to get. So his rent is like a glass of water. It's full. You can't put any more water in it, but you can use up the water before the end of the year because you've got operating expenses. That's painting, maintenance, snow plowing, all kinds of requirements. Repaving or repainting the parking lot, vacuuming the halls in the apartment building, whatever it is. So you have operating expenses that you have to pay out of the rent. You have capital expenses. You have to put a new roof on every now and then. You have to replace those carpets. You have to put in a new stove, a new refrigerator. Now, all you're getting every year from this tenant is a glass of water. What if the tenant's a hoarder? What if the tenant loses their job? What if the tenant in a 2-bedroom apartment lives there with his wife and 4 or 5 children? What if there are young children who spill finger paint on the carpet, roller skate on the tile in the kitchen? There are so many things that can happen. My youngest child fell against the wall in his bedroom and put a big hole in the sheetrock. Now, I happen to know how to fix the sheetrock, and I'm going to do it eventually. There are all kinds of things that can happen, but you only have that glass of water. What if there's a lot of snow this year and you have to bring the snowplow in? What if there's an invasion of mice or bed bugs or bats? Bats can get into the attic in ways you never.
Wow.
Connecticut, they have a bat lady. There's a lady in Connecticut. I don't know if she's
The
still
bat
there. I
lady.
moved out of Connecticut in 2006, but they had a bat lady who was in charge of all the bat programs for the state of Connecticut and what was legal and not legal and ideas that you could have. We had some bats invade a crawl space in a commercial office building, and it was how do we fix it? And the bat lady helped.
But I think what you're getting at, George, is like there's just so many things that you can go wrong, and anytime those things go wrong, they deplete your resources tremendously.
Right. So you have and the tax credit agencies in each state require you to put a certain amount of money every year, a certain percentage of the rent, a certain amount of money for the size and type of the unit in a fund, in a reserve. So the landlords are required, if they have FHA loans or Section 8 properties or public housing or whatever, they have to put a certain amount of money into a capital reserve and an operating reserve every year. Now, during COVID, you couldn't evict a tenant. Some states had reimbursements for the landlords, but not all the landlords got them or were able to. Not all the tenants qualified. In some cases, I probably shouldn't say this, I'm aware of landlords who've spent some of their capital and operating reserves to keep their projects afloat. But now when it comes time to do some landscaping, paint the outside of the building, give the tenants new refrigerators, where are they going to get the money? So the system requires you to plan very carefully for the future and budget for the future and have not only the full glass of water, it also causes some landlords to discriminate against certain tenants who qualify to rent their units, but they don't trust the tenant. The tenant is entitled to the unit, and if they knew that they were discriminated against, they could file a claim with HUD. And we have an obligation to provide housing for those of our population who just don't have either the mental or physical capacity to earn more money. There are seniors. There are veterans. Why do we have the VASH program? Because veterans were getting discriminated against in housing. So HUD created a new program. But we have these families that are hoarders, but they deserve housing. We have our seniors who raised our families, fought our wars, educated our children. They deserve senior housing, and we've got to provide it for them. New York, LA, San Francisco, the three worst cities or markets in terms of the homeless. What you see on the street is horrific. And I see it every day when I get in the car and I leave my home. And it motivates me to work harder and harder than I ever have, even though I'm getting older every day. And we've got to fix it. And that means we have to have more special programs. Our energy prices are going through the roof. There are now federal programs help landlords. They provide financing and in some cases ways of creating rental increases to change the heating and air conditioning systems, to change the insulation, change the windows, the doors, the screens, everything in the house. I worked on a project in the city of San Francisco, roughly 5,500 apartment units, and it took about 2 years to implement the changes. The water savings from those 5,500 units, and we changed on most of the toilets. I mean, it was amazing. All the faucets, everything, would fill a line of tanker trucks, water-filled tanker trucks that would reach from San Francisco to the Mexico border every year.
Wow.
Enough water savings to fill back-to-back tanker trucks all the way to Mexico in 1 year. I did that calculation after the project was done. We had a hard time selling parts of it. If I had done that calculation ahead of time, it would have made it a lot easier. But that's a lot of water, isn't it?
Oh my God. That's a huge impact. And George, I know we're getting towards time right now, and I'm definitely going to bring you back onto the podcast because I still want to talk about what you've been helping with HUD. I definitely want to cover a story or a few stories of tenants that you've been able to help and you've seen being helped with affordable housing, because I would love your help to debunk some of the myths because we're in this to help people. but we got to do it in a sustainable way, but a thoughtful, well planned out way. It's not just a money grab where you try to get all the tax credits now and you just build as many housing and you forget that you have a responsibility down the line.
Let's say one thing. This is all about laws that are passed in Congress that provide the funding to HUD, to the Veterans Associations, to all of these entities that provide senior housing and loans. The Federal Loan Bank, which is not a housing agency, funds a lot of loans across this country. And very few people know about the program. It's one of the largest programs. The USDA, Department of Agriculture, provides housing for farm employees at a scale that is unbelievable. If you're a young couple and you live in a community of under 28,000 people, even though you don't work on a farm, you can get housing assistance to purchase a single family home from the FDA. And it's the best program in the United States. But few people know about it, and you have to live in a small community. And maybe that's what you should do, a new podcast, a separate one. You can do it on affordable housing for young families, how to get your first house.
Yeah, I would do that any day. I mean, this podcast is broad enough that we cover from single family all the way to multifamily. And the reason I did that was because I want people to understand that there's multiple roles in this industry that you can play. Not just on development. Development might be this big, scary monster that people don't know about until they hear that sometimes the problems that you come across in development, even though you've been in 41 states, George, some of the problems in the process, the steps are kind of the same. You got to do a market study. You got to do diligence. You got to have a great team, but every market is different. But if you want to go and make an impact on the single families, like, because that's where you want to dip your toes in the water, then that's okay too. Everybody can play a role in solving this problem. And frankly, we need everybody's participation.
Right.
To be honest. So George, first of all, thank you again so much for what you do. Without people like you, I would never had the home I grew up in. And for that, I'm so grateful that you came onto the podcast today. I'm definitely going to bring you back onto the podcast to talk about other topics. But George, I had so much fun with you today. George, if people want to follow you or learn more about you, what's the best way to reach out to you or learn more about your history?
My wife does all kinds of online. I'm going to have to hire my wife to put together a regular broadcast for me.
I cannot wait. Those of
She
you
did the
that
first website for people with depression in the 90s. Now she does stuff for people with MS, which she has.
I should bring your wife onto the podcast. That's what I should do, George, because I have a portion dedicated to the skills and the life lessons, because I thought about, hey, what if my time comes earlier than I expected? Because people think they have way more time than they do sometimes. And I was thinking about, hey, what are the skills and the life lessons that I can pass on to my daughter? Yeah. And I think bringing your wife onto the podcast would be so helpful. And just, if I can just teach my daughter to focus on serving others, and if she's able to find a fulfillment in that, man, I think I would have done my job as a father, to be honest with you. So I'm so grateful for you coming on.
I gave my youngest a laptop when she was 2.5. And when she finished in the last 2 years of high school, she was in one of these computer-based systems. She actually started in the 7th grade, but in the last 2 years, she and 2 other kids became responsible for maintaining 1,200 computers distributed amongst the students and faculty, doing all the repairs, software upgrades, and that's what she did after school. We have Summit schools here over on the peninsula, and they have schools. They start in they go 7 through 12th grade, and they have them all through the Bay Area and up in Seattle, and then you can license their system online. First day of school in the 7th grade, each kid gets their own laptop.
Wow, that's so cool.
And it's funded by some of the founders of the Bay Area tech companies.
I love that. All right, we'll see you back next time
on Affordable Housing Real Estate.
We are out.